Welcome to Matters Financial and Geopolitical from a Frontier, and thank you for stopping by. If you haven't had a look at that interview I did with Dr. Urs Wiesmann of the University of Bern and his Kenya Atlas, do have a look here. Very interesting detail about the composition of society, about here in Kenya, the differences amongst different communities, the degree of intermarriage now that's happening, which was an interesting comment as well. Macro thoughts, emerging markets, currency reserves, makes interesting reading. Do have a look at that, and it's been a pretty dramatic drop for Russia, that's for sure. I like this from The Guardian. Annie Oakley's heart target in Los Angeles, California. Mark Rothko, must be one of my favorite painters, says, I'm not an abstractionist. I'm not interested in the relationship of color or form or anything else. I'm interested only in expressing basic human emotions, tragedy, ecstasy, doom, and so on. Put up one of my favorite paintings of Rothko as well. Political reflections, the APEC summit and the Pacific Rim Bridge over troubled water. This is an article in The Economist. Look at this first paragraph. In China, even a handshake is an expression of power. When Xi Jinping met Barack Obama in Beijing this week at the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Summit, Mr. Xi stood on the right, his body open towards the cameras in an attitude of confident strength. The visitor was required to approach him as if paying tribute from the left, shoulder defensively towards the photographers. These days, from the smallest details of summit choreography to the biggest global issues, the rivalry between China and America trumps everything. Saying that China's economy will soon overtake America's to become the world's largest. China is once again in league with Russia. On November the 9th, the two signed another huge gas deal. Well, they were thrown together, as it were. In a head-on war, China's armed forces would be no match for America's, but their growing strength will increasingly keep America at arm's length, prevent it from protecting Taiwan, pose a threat to its bases in South Korea and Japan. Mr. Xi could not have been clearer when he declared earlier this year, it is for the people of Asia to uphold the security of Asia. Unfortunately, Pax Americana, this is still The Economist, is giving way to a balance of power that is seething with rivalry and insecurity. Everywhere China sees American plots designed to prevent its rise, American alliances contain it, foreign-funded NGOs undermine the Communist Party, and spies foment protests in Hong Kong and among the Uyghurs in Xinjiang. In August, a Chinese fighter jet and an American surveillance plane passed within 20 feet, just avoiding a mid-air collision. I thought, and these are my conclusions, that Mr. Xi Jinping came out real strong, and I think a lot of that was seen in the photography. And I suppose the longevity of his term, the 10-year cycle, also helps to give a sense of strength. I take you back to that comment when I was talking about the photographs from the African heads of state visit to America. I quoted Barthes, it says, one of the marks of our world is perhaps this reversal. We live according to a generalized image repertoire. And I asked on Monday this week, because I was going through all this footage, do our leaders sit in front of a mirror and practice? The image repertoire from APEC and the G20 made fascinating viewing. Did you see the photograph of the meeting between Xi Jinping and Shinzo Abe? It was as if Xi Jinping was holding his nose. Do our leaders sit in front of a mirror and practice? Then I spoke of a photograph of Putin looking over his shoulder at Barack Obama. Look was one of consternation, like a child who has been let down by a friend and cannot quite internalize it. and I'll put up a photograph of Xi Jinping and Barack Obama. I also put up a photograph I found from The Guardian, but by Getty Images, the funeral of Druze Israeli police officer Zidan Sif in the village of Yanujat. And from that article, a fellow called Caspit writes, the true danger, which Netanyahu did not mention yesterday, is that the wave of terror will turn into a true religious war, such as has not yet occurred here. They will kill Jews in a synagogue, Jews will burn mosques in their towns, and the next big thing could be a terror attack on the Temple Mount. The reality is that a religious subtext to the violence has become increasingly difficult to ignore, and this was the point I was making when I was referring to that article about information warfare struggles, hatred, jealousy, greed, emotions, rather than strategy will set the terms of information warfare struggles, and I think Jerusalem is a classic example of that. Information warfare will not be couched in the rationale of geopolitics, the author suggests, but will be spawned, like any Hollywood drama, out of raw emotions, hatred, jealousy, and greed. It's the lone wolf syndrome, Jonathan Fine said. It's the worst kind of terrorism you can think of because it's unpredictable. And I concluded by saying, the lone wolf syndrome is asymmetric warfare in its most distilled form. Maxime Houchard was a Frenchman who went to Syria in August 2013. French authorities believe, classic example. And talking about Maxime because we're seeing so many white faces to this IS scenario. And I said, some time ago, I think August 25, I said, IS and the likes of Al-Shabaab have proven accomplished and frightening and frightful exponents of the 21st century digital ecosystem. And I said then, what is so fascinating is that their media efforts all point west. The richest hunting ground for these new 21st century serial killers and terrorists is among the disaffected in the Western world. And then on that note, I'll put up a link to a video of IS recruiting Western youth with English language video. Currency markets, Euro 125.46, a little bit of a bounce from year lows, which were close to 124. Dollar index 87.69. Yen continues to tank 118.66, weakest since August 2007, down 2.5% this week. Swissy 0.9574, the pound 156.77, Aussie below 0.86 at 0.8589, India rupee 62.115, South Korean won 1116.41, Rial 257.19, Egyptian pound 714.98, South African rand 1107.80. Dollar index, and I'm a big bull, is at 87.69, and the Bloomberg dollar spot index rose 0.1% to 1099.33, highest close since March 2009. Euro dollar, little bit of a bounce higher. I look for 1 in 2015. This is an interesting article in Bloomberg, and one of the picture accompanying the article is of an illuminated sign displaying the exchange rates for dollar and euro currencies against the Russian ruble outside a currency exchange bureau near the Kremlin. Exchange rate has dropped 13% in the past month, worst tumble since 2009. Central bank has stopped defending the currency, only used $1 billion in November, after spending more than 70 billion in the first 10 months of the year. And essentially, my view is that this is an extraordinarily effective currency warfare. And currency warfare, cyber warfare, all kinds of other 21st century warcraft, drone warfare. President Obama has proved remarkably red in tooth and claw and effective at using these new tools. Qantas Airways is exchanging food trays on overseas trips for serving individual courses by hand including braised Wagyu beef with polenta and chocolate mousse. Crude oil last trading at $74.65. My target is $60. Front month prices have decreased 24% this year. On the 13th of October, I said the conditions are optimal for a complete washout. In my day, we called it a blow-off bottom. As far as $50 a barrel, markets overshoot. This is what I wrote on the 13th of October. Crude oil does it big time, and any and every model needs to consider such a price outcome. US administration has turned price slasher. Like in Alfred Hitchcock's totemic movie Psycho, oil has been sliced up real good. The US has flooded the oil market, and the commodity is now a geopolitical spear. It is the US that is the new price setter, I said, for the oil markets, and this is a deep and important geopolitical development. The new price levels will have immediate, enormous geopolitical, financial knock-on effects. It will place intolerable pressure on oil producers, and particularly those operating from a higher base price. And then today I saw an article from Bloomberg, cheap oil era tilts geopolitical power to the US, which was what I was saying, I'd like to think. Some changes already are evident. Surging US oil production enabled America and its allies to impose tough sanctions on Iran without having to worry much about the loss of imports from the Middle Eastern nation. Russia, meanwhile, faces what President Putin called a possibly catastrophic slump in prices for its oil. A new era of lower prices is being ushered in, said Ed Morse of Citigroup. Undoubtedly, some of the geopolitical changes will be momentous. For 10 years, the defining factor in the oil market was the growth of China and Chinese oil demand. This is Daniel Ye again. Now the defining factor is the astonishing growth of US oil production. Gold back well below 1200 at 1178.49. I think it heads below 1000 in 2015. Coming to sub-Saharan Africa, IOL in South Africa is headlining Africa is a chessboard again as US and China face off. Africa has long been a battleground for world powers. Two giants playing there these days are China, which is spending freely throughout the continent to scoop up resources and tap some of the fastest growing economies, and the US, which is looking to do more business. Both Chinese and US companies expect to profit from their African stakes. The question is whether Africans can win too. China's investments in sub-Saharan Africa have grown 40-fold since 2003, and its state-owned enterprises have been able to roll out projects quickly and in every country on the continent, primarily building things like hydroelectric dams on the Nile, highways to oil regions, and railways to carry iron ore. Saying that after complaints that China was becoming another colonial overlord, China's government and the African Development Bank committed $2 billion to a fund designed to help African companies win Chinese contracts. US development in Africa has been private sector driven and concentrated in just a few countries. President Obama wants American companies to do more, and they're doing a lot more. Last week I had dinner with the Assistant Secretary for Energy, in the environment, and seemed business in Africa, and previously worked for Steve Jobs. And if you look at the level of engagement out of the US, it's of a different level. In 2012, I said, I think they finally woke up. I was talking about the US. I don't know when the penny dropped. I said for a long time, we're too much supply for the global market, but there wasn't much demand. Then China came along, increased the demand, and it was that increased demand that has lifted our economy in the last 10 years. Now everybody in Washington is going on, hang on a second, how do we reverse this process? How do we repel the Chinese? And I was referring to a document, The Pivot to Asia, which I've spoken to you about before. I said it is a very complex collision, and I think if it's a game of money, then China wins, because China is the banker. But if it's a game of using hard power, America is going to win it in the short term, I said. And then I was, in another article, I was saying it is clear that the United States and US Africa Command have carved out a much more forward position on the African continent. In some respects, Barack Obama's pivot to Asia detours through Africa. I was saying China's made a parabolic advance across the African continent, and one of the desired side effects of staunching the Al-Qaeda, Al-Shabaab advance is that it also counters the Chinese advance via the insertion of US hard power. The US cannot challenge China's extreme dollar diplomacy, but it can insert hard power with which it can tilt the African pitch. And saying that although US Africa Command was set up under a previous president's watch, I think the penny dropped to rate China's extraordinary surge in Africa only quite recently. I wrote this in 2012. Zbigniew Brzezinski once said, and I think he's really the architect of this whole Ukraine situation, and I disagree with him on that point. I think that was a bit of an overreach. There would have been better keeping Putin on side and challenging China as opposed to throwing Putin into China's hands and then being triangulated. The three grand imperatives of imperial geostrategy are to prevent, I love this, collusion and maintain security dependence among the vassals, keep tributaries pliant and protected, and keep the barbarians from coming together. I said, I think the interesting point is how Africa has become more central to the geopolitical global puzzle, and this collision I've outlined between US hard power and China's soft power. And then on that same point, that a sine qua non of President Obama's pivot to Asia is US NATO power projection over the Indian Ocean, in my view. Professor Felipe Fernandez Amesto explains why the precocity of the Indian Ocean as a zone of long-range navigation and cultural exchange is one of the glaring facts of history, made possible by the reversible escalator of the monsoon wind. I said I have no doubt, and this was in August last year, that the Indian Ocean is set to regain its glory days. And I was talking about how, if you shut down the Indian Ocean and you cut off China from the supply of oil, China should close down pretty quickly. I put up a photograph of the setting sun in Lamu, refer you to an article in Der Spiegel, The Caliphate's Colonies, Islamic State's gradual expansion into North Africa. The IS puts down roots wherever chaos reigns, where governments are weakest and where disillusionment over the Arab Spring is deepest. In recent weeks, terror groups that have thus far operated locally have quickly begun siding with the extremists from IS. Moving on, Burkina Faso named its army colonel Zida as prime minister. If you haven't read my piece about Ouagadougou's signal to sub-Saharan Africa, do take a look at it. I think Ouagadougou marks an inflection point. During the Arab Spring, now in the bleak midwinter, nearly all commentators spoke of how this North African wildfire could not leap the Sahara and head to sub-Saharan Africa. The reasons were that the state incumbency had a monopoly on the tools of violence and would bring overwhelming force and violence to bear. And I said in this article, we need to ask ourselves, how many people can an incumbent shoot stone cold dead in such a situation? 100, 1,000, 10,000? This is another point. There is a threshold beyond which the incumbent can't go. Where that threshold lies will be discovered in the throes of the event. Therefore, the preeminent point to note is that protests in Burkina Faso achieved escape velocity. Overthrowing incumbents is all about speed. Out of a population of 17 million people in Burkina, over 60% are aged between 17 and 24. This is another point to note. The country's youth flex their muscles. What's clear is that a very young, very informed, and very connected African youth demographic, many characterize it as a demographic dividend, which, however, for beautiful Blaze turned into a demographic terminator, is set to alter the existing equilibrium between the rulers and the subjects, and the rebalancing has begun. And the point, 2 points. I was listening to the radio this morning, and a guy called Herman Cohen, I think was a US Assistant Secretary for Africa, gave a very shrill warning to Kabila and said, Ouagadougou would be nothing if Kabila tried to extend his term. And I think he's right. And similarly, I think, President Grace Mugabe is similarly untenable. So maybe she can get into power whilst her husband's around, but she's not going to last a minute after he's gone. The World Bank now expects the impact of the Ebola epidemic to be around $3 to $4 billion, well below a worst-case scenario of $32 billion. The UN is saying the spread of Ebola is linked to defecation in the open. Nearly half of all Liberians who were employed when the Ebola outbreak began are no longer working, a survey by the World Bank has found. And then Javier Blas, who's a friend at the FT, tweeted FAO statistics hunger map, Africa remains a major spot. The South African all shares up 8.418% in 2014. Dollar rand 1107.92. I think that's going to 12. Egyptian pound, as it has been for eternity, 714.98. Egyptian stock market up 34.94%. On the 10th of November, when I wrote that article about Ouagadougou, I said this: turning to the markets in Africa, the Nigerian Naira and the Nigerian all-share index have been Ouagadougou'd by the collapse in the price of oil. Nigeria is now making a budget cut pledge, but it fell short of what the market needed. Nigeria's finance minister said on November 16 she will propose to lower the budgeted benchmark oil price to $73 per barrel next year from 77.5 this year. And I made some tweets yesterday where I said, Nigeria, I thought, might do a Norman Lamont, hike interest rates beyond the economy's tolerance. And I said that would be a huge sell signal for the Naira. Put up an image of Norman Lamont and remind you of Black Wednesday, which refers to 16th September 1992, when the British Conservative government was forced to withdraw the pound from the European exchange rate mechanism. The UK government attempted to prop up the sinking pound. Major raised interest rates of 10%, authorised the spending of billions worth of foreign currency reserves to buy up sterling. None of it worked. This is the famous story when Druckenmiller and Soros bet the bank against the Bank of England and made off with about £1 billion. One of my favourite quotes is from Druckenmiller, who says, as a macro investor, my job for 30 years was to anticipate changes in the economic trends that were not expected by others and therefore not yet reflected in securities prices. Soros taught me that when you have tremendous conviction on a trade, you have to go for the jugular. It takes courage to be a pig. As far as Soros is concerned, when you're right on something, you can't own enough. While most people credit the trade to Soros, the actual idea came from Druckenmiller. I think the Nigerian Naira heads to 200, and I do not think the central bank has the firepower. Currency closed at 173.48 on Wednesday, increasing losses to 8.5% this year. Nigeria's reserves are down $7 billion, or 16%, from a year ago. The Nigerian all share fell 2.15% yesterday and is down 17.382% year to date. Ghana hopes to seal a provisional agreement with the IMF on financial assistance this week and aims to cut its budget deficit to 6.6% of GDP in 2015. The stock market is at the highest since September 24 and has been turning higher. The cedi is down 26% this year against the dollar, but has rallied 16% since August, since they started talking with the IMF. I spoke about this when I said, look at Ghana, where the president claims he's looking for a homegrown solution to a situation of his own making, and frankly there isn't one. And I was advising he should pick up the phone to Madame Lagarde, which he eventually did. And I think that shows you why the IMF's engagement remains relevant in Africa, because policymakers will continue to make mistakes. On the coast of Togo, these men partake in active fishing with large nets released near the shore that are then pulled onto the beach by the strength of dozens of young men joined in a cooperative. The photograph was by Roberto Una. Kenya is planning to borrow up to $750 million by reopening its international bond issued in June. This is the Treasury Secretary Henry Rotich saying in a statement to Parliament that Reuters saw on Wednesday. That's interesting, and I think they'll also look to do a sukuk, a samurai, and it's one of the key points I've been making. Money is available in a way that it wasn't previously in Africa. Centum reported first half profit after tax increased 38%, dividend income up 34%, interest income down 12%. Fund management, they've shown 337 million versus zero previously. Unrealized gains of $1 billion. Profit after tax up 24%, profit before tax up 24%, profit after tax up 38%. Talking about a 42% growth in total assets. I'll put up a chart and you can see the market capitalization increase. The first 6 months, they're saying that property is a third of their portfolio, and the entire briefing is on rich wrap-ups. Very strong results, showing great leadership under James Moria. Kenya Power has secured a $190 million loan for an infrastructure upgrade. They're obviously trying to connect more people. They've got a document out there if you fancy filling it in to give them a better perspective on the forward view of demand. I'll put that up. KPLC is up 15.9% this year. What's interesting is they have a base price. That base price was lifted by the government from somewhere like 0.40 to 0.77, and that's really helped drive full year earnings up very dramatically. Full year profit after tax up 87.4%. In this digital age, non-state elements can unleash a series of events that affect a country's image and economy. This is Kobo, and that's what the point I was making when I said post-Eurobond Kenya exists in a goldfish bowl. We also need to appreciate that we exist now, and post the Eurobond sale, we have allowed the markets to price us on a real-time, continuous basis in a goldfish bowl. In such circumstances, it behoves us to sharpen up our messaging, because right now it's very 20th century, very VOK. I think that's what Kobo is speaking about. The shilling softened up, touched 90.30, but back at 90.15 last. All share up 19.012%, eased 0.18% yesterday. NSE 20 ticked 0.16% higher. That's up 3.877% this year. Commentary, Sassini Tea and Coffee, which had retreated 21.16% through yesterday, bounced by the daily limit on light volume. There is a roadmap for creating shareholder value. Sell some land in Kiambu and book it through the balance sheet, which so far the company has spoken about for eternity, but conspicuously failed to action. Safaricom eased 0.36% off a record close at 13.75, closed at 13.70. Uchumi Rights traded 3.257 million times at 50 cents a share. Today's interesting, it's traded at 20 cents. Meanwhile, the ordinary shares traded higher. Kenya Airways ticked 1.88% lower to close at 7.80. This has to be the bottom for Kenya Airways, otherwise it's going to be very, very dramatic. The bank saw good trading action. I think this was off the back of the Citibank report, where they pegged Equity Bank as being the most expensive bank versus fair value. KenGen rallied 5.47%, and Mumias, which had become extremely oversold, but has rallied 28.571% over the last 5 trading sessions. Probably has more to go, because that really had become very egregious. Once again, thank you for stopping by.